Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you're all having a great evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Um, Thank you for participating in this talk today as we mark the UN International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. My name is Dr. Mary Booth, and I manage the Center for the Study of International Slavery, a partnership organization between the University of Liverpool and National Museums Liverpool, namely the International Slavery Museum. As CSIS approaches its 20th anniversary in 2026, we are honored and deeply humbled by the opportunity to continue to develop and advance research around the history of transatlantic slavery, the city of Liverpool, and the legacies of this practice in its historical and contemporary manifestations, with partners and institutions locally, nationally, and internationally. We are thrilled you're all able to join us for this year's book talk hosted by CSIS and Liverpool University Press. Established in 1899, Liverpool University Press is the third oldest university press in England, following the likes of Cambridge and Oxford. Today, we are celebrating a groundbreaking work by Dr. William Jennings to the Liverpool Studies in International Slavery series. Published in association with CSIS, this series aims to deepen our understanding and foster informed debate about slavery in its many dimensions. By adopting international, comparative, and interdisciplinary approaches, it examines the origins, practices, resistance, and aftermath of slavery across different social and historical periods. For further information on this series and past CSIS book talks featuring contributors from around the globe, we invite you to check out our website at CSIS YouTube page. Tonight, we are very excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. William Jennings. Dr. Jennings teaches in the French program of the University of Waikato in New Zealand, where he is also the deputy head of the School of Arts. He has written extensively on the history of Creole societies and their languages, with a particular focus on early French Caribbean. He is the author with Stefan Fendar of Inheritance and Innovation in a Creole Language, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017, and of Dibia's World, which we will hear about in more detail tonight, published by Liverpool University Press in 2023. During the event tonight, we will provide a link to Dibia's World in the chat, so you are more than welcome to check it out, purchase copies for your friends, all of that. An additional strand of Dr. Jennings' research centers the writings of the first French missionaries to the Pacific and their descriptions of indigenous people and European settlers At present, he is working on a scholarly edition of the 17th century sugar planters manuscript that is the principal source for this evening's talk. We're now going to hear from Dr. Jennings in detail about Dibia's World. And please, if you have any questions for him, pop those in the Q&A, and we will have plenty of time to discuss all aspects of his book following his presentation. A final note, I want you to know this event is being recorded, except for the Q&A. All of that will remain private within this Zoom, and this will be available to view on the CSI website and YouTube page following this event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. William Jennings.
Right, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Many thanks for inviting me to this talk. I'll just share my screen with you. So that should be visible now. It's particularly important to me to have been invited to talk on this day, so the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, because a lot of what I do is very close to that aspect. Now, when we look at the numbers, immense numbers, 12.5 million people loaded into ships in Africa and sent across the Atlantic to the Americas. Many more died before reaching the slaveholding pens in the port cities. Many, of course, died en route. But how many of those people do we actually know by name? How much do we know about how they lived and worked and ate and rested, and the aspects of their daily lives? What about how did they cope? We know a lot of things for more recent times, the later years of the slave trade and slavery, but we know very little about the early years, the establishment phase. And this is something I've been looking at in my research and been looking at individuals, trying to find out more about individuals to understand how they lived, how they coped. So here we have an example from the manuscript at the heart of my book. An enslaved family. It's from an inventory on a plantation taken in May 1690. So we have here three individuals, Dune, Anne, and Paul, husband, wife, and their baby son. We already have significant information that we can extract about them from these brief biographies. We can add so much more to enrich our understanding of their lives using shipping records and other information, as we'll see throughout this talk. So I'd just like you to remember as we go through this talk that the focus is on individuals. Certainly we get a group portrait, we get an understanding of the overall trade and plantation life, but I've tried as much as possible to keep the focus on individuals, ordinary human beings, uprooted by the slave trade. So in the talk tonight, I'd like to discuss, first of all, the source manuscript, and then the importance of the earliness and the detail in the manuscript that allows us to reconstruct people's lives and moments in their lives. We'll look at the enslaved community on a sugar plantation, their origins, their names, their families, their health, their daily life, and then what agency they had as enslaved people. So to begin with, the manuscript. It's been in France, Normandy, the library in Rouen for a couple of centuries now. The author is Jean Goupil. He was the son of a Parisian doctor, and he spent 15 years in the Atlantic world in the late 1600s. That's probably a self-portrait of him there. It's the very last page of the manuscript. He's just finished writing, and he looks very pleased with himself. When you're dealing with a manuscript, of course, it's very important with any historical document to find out if it is genuine or not. The manuscript was mentioned in the 1770s, and I've been able to confirm its authenticity through multiple checks from other archives, shipping records, parish records, legal records, and even the calculations by NASA, because Guppy mentions an eclipse taking place in the colony where he was based, and it turns out that that colony was the best place in the world to see that particular eclipse, which did occur on the day he mentioned. So there's a lot of corroborating information confirming that this manuscript is indeed genuine. It's a hefty document, 395 pages, and it covers two trips to the colony of French Guiana in North and South America, really on the fringe of what might be called the Caribbean sphere of activity. It is travel writing, but most importantly, it's the description of a plantation, an inventory of the enslaved workers on that plantation, and then information about how to manage a plantation, how to manage slaves, the whole preparation, cultivation process for sugar cane, then how to produce sugar, how to make sugar, or how to market sugar, how to sell sugar. The whole process is in that manuscript, and it's possible to gain more information about the daily lives of those enslaved people right throughout the manuscript. It's not just the inventory we can draw on, but the many references he makes to enslaved people right through the manuscript. And that manuscript is very early. And that earliness is extremely important in the history of slavery in the Americas because many, if we could say most works about slavery in the Americas, they tend to focus on the final century of slavery. There is a kind of recency bias, and that's because there's more information available. There are more archives, plantation documents are more likely to have survived. There's a greater range of sources. You have newspapers and things like that that you don't have from the early years. On top of that, there are other forms of research. Archaeological information, for example, tends to be more recent because the more recent plantation buildings will have overlaid earlier plantation buildings. So we know a lot less about the early phase of what we can consider as industrial slavery, when the sugar plantation complex begins in the 1600s. So all of these wonderful sources that I've mentioned there that have inspired me in my work, they tend to focus on the period of slavery from the second half of the 1700s and then through to abolition. But we know much less about life before peak slavery, before the end of the trade, because we have that period, of course, in the 1800s when the transatlantic trade has been abolished, when planters realize that if they want future slave labor, it needs to come from their current enslaved people who have to have children. So the planters are going to be more sympathetic towards pregnant women. They're going to be more concerned about raising enslaved children to make them into future laborers compared to what happened before the trade was abolished. And we also know much less about the establishment phase of industrial slavery, the setting up of sugar plantations. Um, so the manuscript provides a very valuable counterpoint. Apart from all the detail it provides, there is this counterpoint to more established or to studies of slavery in its more established phase in that final century. The detail in the manuscript, when corroborated, when checked against other evidence, when built up with shipping records, birth, death, and marriage records, and so on, gives us a great deal of information about daily life for enslaved people on a sugar plantation. It's possible to do what Jenny Shaw in her work has called educated reconstructions, which is where the historian of slavery, or indeed another aspect of history, um, is able to take their knowledge of a particular time and write a kind, well, and engage in what could be called creative writing to imagine scenes of daily life. With this manuscript, we don't have to imagine them. They're described. We have, for example, a scene that actually opens the book when four enslaved people report that a man called Dibia has been beaten savagely by an overseer. And each of those people provides separate pieces of information. We have four voices of enslaved people from the 17th century and a rather traumatic scene as well. Um, there are people on this plantation who were transported from Africa on a particularly difficult voyage. A record exists, a report of that voyage condemning the captain exists, and it's been possible to uh, use that voyage report with the plantation record to reconstruct the moments of arrival in the colony. So there's a lot of information available there. And another scene that's been possible to reconstruct is an enslaved man who's been in the colony for 6 years decides to convert to Christianity. The planter, Gupi, decides to act as his godfather. But the thing is, Uli, the man in question, was transported from a colony, from a slave post where Gupi worked in Africa as an agent. So it's quite possible that Gupi was there when Uli was enslaved, when he was loaded into a slave ship, and now 6 years later, he's there when Uli is baptized. So we have these moments that it's possible that are possible to be reconstructed through the detail available in the plantation and indeed in the availability of other archives from the time. And with those archives, we can piece together histories of individuals and of families. We can find out when people arrived, given that Guppy mentions the name of the ship or the ship's captain, and that allows us to get more information. For example, here we discover that Anne, um, the wife here, she was 39 when she arrived, and 10 months after her arrival in the colony, uh, she gave birth to a baby boy. So it's quite clear from that that she was married immediately on arrival. And her husband, a Yoruba man, had nothing in common with her, apart from the fact that they were both enslaved and that they both had dark skin. Otherwise, culturally, they're completely different. Linguistically, they can't even talk to each other. This is clearly a forced marriage here. So, piecing together this information about the individuals of the plantation, all the individuals of the plantation, allows us greater understanding of what life was like as an enslaved person in the 17th century. Overall, the plantation as an enslaved community in May 1690 of 93 people. 71 of them are adults. Of those, there are 40 men, 31 women. There are 22 children, 11 boys and 11 girls, all born in the colony. And almost every one of the adults arrived as an adult in the colony. This is quite different to the 19th century. In the 19th century, you're getting more children transported from Africa. But in the 17th century, it tends to be more adults simply because, for demographic reasons, there are more adults available because you haven't yet had 2 centuries of the slave trade in the 19th century, by the time you get to the 19th century. The inventory, you see an extract of it there. That's one page of the manuscript. So the inventory goes on for several pages, listing those 93 people, giving us information about the ships that transported them or when the children were born. It also provides information about 11 deaths that occurred on the plantation in the enslaved community over the previous 2 years, and mentions 2 stillbirths as well. With that information, it is possible to then provide a portrait of the enslaved community. We find, for example, that most of them are from Ouida, which is what was known as the Slave Coast at the time, around what is now Benin, Togo, southwest or western Nigeria. But then there are other people transported from Senegal, from Calabar, from Angola, from a large range of different languages and cultures across Western and Western Central Africa. This inventory is from 1690. The plantation itself, the enslaved community in that colony, is only 30 years old. We know information about, could almost say every ship of the time, almost every ship over those 30 years. This is unlike almost any other slave-based colony in the Americas, because normally we don't have that information about the early years, particularly not in the 1600s, because in the 1600s, most colonies were private ventures. There was no requirement for record keeping. But in the French system, 1664, those private ventures were nationalized. A bureaucracy sprang into place, and there were governors and so on who had to account for everything, had to report everything back to the Minister of Colonies. So we have information about shipping that, of course, we can match with shipping records in the various port city archives. Some of those early ships, well, those early ships for the first few years were Dutch, and then the French took over. We have a fairly small colony in 1690 in French Guiana, just 1,100 enslaved people, but we know where they came from. And because we know the ships and the dates those ships arrived, thanks to the manuscript and thanks to other records, it's possible not only to reconstruct the enslaved community in 1690, but in earlier years as well. So we can look at the shift in uh, ethnic proportions throughout those years. So we can say, for example, that there were mostly people from Ouida in the early years, and then later on, people came from other cultures. So we can imagine what it would have been like if you were on the first ship from Senegal and you arrived on that plantation and you didn't speak the language, you didn't understand the culture of anyone else on that plantation. So we have these, again, these moments that can be reconstructed from uh, the records over time. So it's not just a snapshot of 1690, but it goes back 30 years. Because the planter, Jean Goupy, had experience in West Africa, he knew something of languages of West Africa, and he recorded the names, the African names, the names enslaved people were called within the slave community in his inventory. So very often people have three names in the inventory. They have their official name that was given to them by the purchaser. Then they have the everyday name that the whites used on the plantation. This is because usually the official name was Jean or Marie or something like that, and you have 7 Jean on the plantation, so you need to distinguish them in some ways. But you also have the name of the name used by the people, the enslaved people on the plantation. Children will often have 2 names recorded in the inventory, and I suspect that there are times when there will be a third name. When you have a couple of the same ethnicity, they will surely have given their child a name from that ethnic group, but not necessarily have communicated it to the planter. Then you have names linked to professions. Louis, for example, in the quote there in the box, known as Bukan, but called Bono by the blacks, which means surgeon in the language of the blacks of Ouida. I haven't been able to find evidence of that in the online lexicons from languages spoken around Ouida, but Kupi is reporting it. And Bono's wife is called Tassi. Now, in the language of her region, Tassi means auntie or aunt, a familiar term for aunt. And I suspect that she was probably the midwife, the surgeon's wife. I suspect she was probably the plantation midwife, but Guppy doesn't mention that role. In fact, he says very little, as we'll see shortly, about the role of women on the plantation. Sometimes when people have important names, that name appears in other contexts. Dibia is one of the most important people on the plantation. His wife is simply called Isabelle Dibia. So that yeah, influence extends to the wife. That is not usually the case, but it's a sign of the importance of Dibia. When we look beyond the names to the families, we see that those families are multilingual and multicultural. There is a great deal of evidence showing forced marriages, that women were married immediately on arrival. But they were not married immediately on arrival to men who came on the same ship with them. They were married to veteran men on the plantation, men who'd been there for several years already, and men that Guppy described as being good workers. Effectively, women then were rewards. They were incentives. The planter would tell the men, if you work hard, I'll give you a wife on the next slave ship. We have, evidence when a group of people is purchased off a ship, there might be several men and several women. If the women had the choice of spouse, they would no doubt choose someone of their own ethnic group. But most of the time they don't. They're married, as we saw with Anne, they're married to someone from a completely different group. And they're married to someone immediately, given the date of childbirth. They're married to someone immediately on arrival, to someone they don't understand. So we clearly have basically eugenics at work here. Hard workers will have the chance to have children. We also see in the study of families that when there are siblings, because very often there's only one child, when there are siblings, there are generally age gaps. We have, for example, there, Marc and René, there's a gap of 7 years between the two. And the couple, the parents of those children, well, they haven't had a child since. So, or at least they don't have a living child, but it's quite likely that in those age gaps, other children were born and did not survive. We see that even very young children are rated by their potential as workers, right? A 6-year-old will be a good worker. And I even have a case, there's a 4-year-old who will also be a good worker. We can tell, well, we can infer from the records of the families that there's a very great loss of children, a very high infant mortality, and a very low birth rate. That suggests that no special privileges are given to pregnancies, to new mothers, to babies. The planter is not yet thinking that these children will be future workers. For the moment, they're an economic loss because they're taking a laborer away in the form of the mother. And they're a cost because those children are to be fed. So at this stage, in the early stage of slavery, children are not important. We'll see in the 19th century, it's very different. Once that slave trade's abolished, children become very, very important because they are the future of the labor force. In the early years, there's always another slave ship coming. And it's cheaper, effectively, to buy an adult than it is to invest, if you like, in a child, feed it for 10 years in the hope that it will become a future laborer on the plantation. So there's a great deal of cynicism at this time. Well, the whole thing is cynical, of course, but there's certainly not consideration given to children. As far as the plant is concerned, his role is to have that baby baptized. That's the important part. If the child survives, then yes, in 10 or 20 years, 10 or 12 years, that child will be a useful addition to the plantation. If we look at the number of children compared to the number of women, it is not a sign of a healthy environment. Most of the 31 women on the plantation are of childbearing age. And yet, among them, they have only 22 living children. It's a consequence of overwork and malnutrition affecting fertility, not being able to look after their children properly either because they're having to work in the fields. So there's nothing there that is favorable to the survival of children. And we can take a closer look at that when we see a quote there. One of the stillbirths, a woman, a heavily pregnant woman, has been sent to work on a construction site, the fortifications of the colony, the royal works. She's had to work there, laboring there, and um, she lost her son as a result. We can take another case. Four women were transported by the same ship, 1682. There they are on their arrival. Look at their ages. They were 18, 18, 25, and 28, all of childbearing age. And yet, after 8 years on the plantation, those four have only two living children. So there are a lot of signs that the colony is not, or the sugar plantation environment is an extremely unhealthy environment. We have further confirmation of that in the works of an entomologist, Maria Sibylla Merian, uh, who went to the Dutch colony of Suriname, which bordered French Guiana. She was there just a few years after he was there. The daughter of a watercolorist, she painted the most wonderful watercolors illustrating the insects and the plants of Suriname. And she also reported things that were largely unknown by other Europeans because they weren't interested. She discovered, for example, that the peacock flower illustrated there, the seed of the peacock flower was used to make labor easier, but it was also used to induce abortions. And it was used by the enslaved Native Americans of the Dutch in that colony, and no doubt by enslaved people in French Guiana as well. And you see her note there. As for the negresses transported to Suriname from the Guinea or Angola coast, they do not seek to have children and, in effect, have them rarely. So, this is also, and I'll come to this a little bit later on, an example of agency. Um, Enslaved people didn't have much agency, but one choice was to deny planters future enslaved workers by not having children. This is not a healthy environment at all. And Guppy provides plenty of evidence of other effects of enslavement on health. Many of the people in the inventory have some sort of injuries, especially to their feet and to their legs. If you're working, you're cutting cane in those cane fields, you're working in tropical soil, lots of parasites and so on in there. It's very easy to cut yourself on a piece of cut cane. And in the equatorial climate, it's quite likely that those cuts can go bad. So people's feet and legs are particularly affected. And you have the impression that there are a lot of people shuffling around the plantation due to the injuries to the soles of their feet and to their legs. They're also affected by hunger and malnutrition. They're very tired. It means diseases, they have low resistance to disease. And then on top of that, there are the punishments. So there are a lot of effects on people's physical health. The plantation is a dangerous workspace. The illustration there is of a sugar mill, the standard form that you will find throughout the Americas, with the three vertical rollers powered either by oxen turning that central axle that you see coming out of the top, or by a water mill, occasionally by a windmill. There would be one person on either side. It was usually considered women's work. One person on either side who would feed cut sugar cane between those rollers back and forth, squeezing out the juice. You can imagine working on that for a long, long shift, and you make one mistake and you get your fingers caught in the roller. There were, many dangerous aspects to work on the sugar plantation. Occasionally, we get hints of the psychological effects of enslavement. There are people who are physically fit, but who are described as being useless or weak. There's one young man, he's 28, he's in a fine state of health, and yet we get him to make fishing nets. He's never been worth much. Um, there's obviously some psychological aspect of work here, whether it's the trauma of the voyage, whether it's depression, he's simply given up on life. Maybe there's an underlying condition, autism or something like that. We don't know, but we know that there is some effect on his psychological health. If you did get sick, there were at least three forms of medical practice available on the plantation. There was the official sanctioned European one. An inexperienced surgeon there on a 3-year contract called André Renou was there uh, to treat injured people, people with illness, um, using European techniques, which really were still based on the humours, the bile and so on, uh, not very advanced at all. There were African specialists, Dibia the expert, Bono the surgeon, Tassi possibly the midwife. They had tropical knowledge, understanding of tropical diseases. There were medicinal plants brought over on the slave ships. There were also similar plants available um, in the Americas and the tropical parts of the Americas that they may have recognized and been able to use. And then you had the local experts, the Native Americans. But the planters were a little bit wary of them because of the exorcistic or ritualistic nature. So they had to be very careful. They didn't want, the planters didn't want to be accused of um, any sort of alternate religious practice, particularly not in 1690, just 5 years after the King of France had made Catholicism the only permissible religion. So it was possible, according to Gouvy, if the surgeon could not heal someone, he could try to find an Indian or black who claims to be a healer. But any treatment must be done in the presence of the surgeon and the master. They must take no chances when treating an enslaved person. So what was daily life like in an early sugar plantation? Well, it was mostly about work, and there was lots of it. And most days were not about cane. For most people, they were not working in the cane field every day. There was plenty of other work. On an early plantation, there was work to clear forests. The plantation attempted to be self-sufficient. They couldn't rely much on supplies from Europe, so it was also a working farm, growing food crops, raising animals, sheep, goats, pigs, and so on. And of course, oxen for to power to drive the carts and so on. There was hunting and fishing. There was building. New buildings were needed. There's a hint in these early days too, early years, of the plantation being somewhat mobile. That every few years you would move the buildings once you'd cleared a new cane field. This is something you don't get as much of in the 19th century. There was also maintenance. You can see the building, the illustration at the top on the right there. That comes from the manuscript, showing the sugar refinery building, the 7 holes in the side. That's 7 furnaces, fed from the outside. There's an image there from an archaeological site, very close to where the plantation was, showing the remains of those or similar furnaces. On top of each of those furnaces was a large basin, and the sugar cane was slowly, or the cane juice was slowly reduced to syrup and then to sugar on those bowls. During that, well, the enslaved people had to construct buildings like that and maintain them. And that could be quite a task given the extremes of climate, the tropical rainfall, and so on. And then, particularly in the early years of the colony, there were the royal works, which was construction and maintenance. of colonial infrastructure, the roads, bridges, ports, the fortifications, and so on. But 1689, there were just over, in the previous year, just under, we're looking at about 130 days per year of sugar production when the plantation swings into factory mode. Everyone has an assigned task on the assembly line from cutting cane to producing sugar. And on those days, the work steps up to another level. There are very, very long shifts. People work through the night, especially in the refining area and the crushing of cane. It's extremely intense work, but it's not all of the time. The enslaved people have this range of tasks. There are many, many different professions mentioned in the manuscript. I've put most of them there on the right-hand side in that box. It shows that enslaved people had multiple skills in these early years. Now, in later plantation societies, uh, you had specialists very often from the free people of color caste in those colonies, otherwise workers from Europe, based in towns who would travel around plantations carrying out these skills. But in the early years, in a new colony, the people on the plantation, enslaved people, had to have multiple skills. But those roles went to men systematically. There were very few specified roles for women. In the manuscript, there are only 5 mentioned. Right, the cook, the laundress, one of the women is the planter's official mistress, and then Tassi, potential midwife, gathers herbs, and then there's a teenage girl whose job it is to feed chickens. Those are the only women's roles or tasks assigned to women. The rest of the time, I would assume, based on other descriptions of plantations, although they're not as early, but I would assume that the women were the ones who had the the roles of with the most drudgery, weeding the cane fields, planting the sugar cane. They were the field laborers much more than the men. The men had a variety of tasks. There's a little bit more interest in the men's tasks. You know, one day you might be working on the master's garden, the next day you could be driving a cart. And then the day after that, you would go into the forest and help clear the forest as an axeman or a sawyer. So there's a range of tasks. I'm not saying they were fun, but they were certainly more, they had more variety compared to what the women were doing. Also, something we see on this, or that we don't see on the early plantation, is the gang system that we see in the 18th and 19th centuries, where the plantation has a number of gangs. The first gang is the strong young men and women. They do the hard work. And then you go down through several gangs, the older people, the children, doing small tasks. The plantation doesn't seem to be organized along those lines yet, probably because of the requirement for so much, so many different roles per person, um, because it's a new colony just being set up and a new plantation just being, just in that establishment phase, effectively. What did people eat? Well, the planter provided quite a long list. And it's quite remarkable that most of the diet was strongly West African. An okra and pea soup that he called canulu. Of course, you find it in other, right across the Caribbean, and yams. He lists plenty of other foods, such as pineapple, with an illustration. But the core diet is very restricted, but it is West African. So these are crops that were brought over with the ships, first slave ships to the colony. There's rum, there's local alcohols, and rather a lot. There's the enslaved people get a lot of rum each day, and more rum during sugar production times because they're having to work harder. There were two ways of providing rations to the enslaved community. One was that the planter provided all rations. The other was that people were given a little bit of time off to grow their own food in gardens, but there was never enough food. And a report from 1709 in the colony describes people on the sugar plantations as feeble skeletons. So these are not people living happy lives with sufficient food. They had very little time for rest. And when they did rest, it was in darkness. Their family, they saw their children, most of the time it was in darkness. We're in a tropical colony, 12-hour days, 12-hour nights, short sunsets, short sunrises. You work, the people would be forced to assemble at dawn. Just before dawn, they would be woken up. They had to assemble and line up in front of the master, say the Lord's Prayer while the master inspected them, and then at sunrise, they would head off to their daily tasks, which they would work on until uh, sunset. And on nights of a full moon, they might be out there working at that time as well. They had very little time off. Um, they had Sundays off, which really meant they would not do the usual plantation tasks. They would have to go to mass, and it appears in the early years they were marched to mass rather than um, going voluntarily. There's definitely some a hint of forced march going on. They had to tend to their gardens, but there were times when they indulged in dances because people were, the planters would condemn people for dancing. And these would be gatherings by ethnic group and performing sometimes just outside the fortifications. So really almost trying to provoke the the planter caste. The illustration there is from a page on how to make rum. This was the official planters' rum, but the rum makers would often steal it and use it on Sundays, share it with their friends. Now, a question of agency. How much agency did enslaved people have? The answer is very little, but there were many subtle ways they could get back at the owners, or they could show some sort of control, even small control over aspects of their lives. Probably the most flagrant one we've seen so far is a question of birth control. But there were plenty of others that the planter complained about, working slowly. The moment they were unsupervised, they would have a rest in the woods. Um, they would ignore the cows or the bullocks they were looking after and just go and sleep in the shade somewhere. They would take food from from the master's garden. They would sell things illicitly, sometimes even to other planters, rather than having just selling to other enslaved people. They would become absent. They would absent themselves from the plantation for a day or two. And in some cases, there were runaways. Guppy reported that there were three people from the most recent slave ship who had run away from the plantation and who were living in the hills the um, above the plantation. When we look at the portrait of the man, this is the only portrait of an African in the manuscript. I wish I knew who it was, but unfortunately, Guppy didn't say. Um, We see that he has earrings. So uh, again, a little hint of um, well, it's strong to call it agency. If a little bit of self-decoration can be considered agency, but there are just little hints of what one could call moments of choice, moments of freedom, very brief moments of freedom. But every time you rested, every time you chose to work slowly, you were getting back at the planter. It was a small form of resistance. There's very little evidence of active resistance. There would be a plantation whose workforce would rise up a few years later and slaughter the overseers, but it's really an exception. There's very little agency at this time. More agency would become apparent later on when there would be maroon communities, so whole communities of runaway uh, enslaved people um, living in the colony. So very little agency in the early years of the colony, very little hope of freedom, certainly for the men, no hope of freedom. For the women, marrying a planter was probably the best hope of freedom that they had. So overall, we've seen the importance of the manuscript, the importance of its earliness, and the detail in the manuscript, which, when combined with other records, enables us to reconstruct moments in the lives of an enslaved community. That detail allows us to find out where people were from, when they arrived. Um, it tells us that there was an African community that was maintained, even though it was a fusion of many, many cultures. We see the beginnings of a Creole society in that plantation society described in 1690, that somehow, despite the situation, the very difficult situation of the forced labor, the intensive forced labor on that plantation that affected people's health, um, somehow people managed to survive that, create a new culture, create a new language, showing moments of agency that would lead to modern Creole society in the colony, and indeed in similar environments, other sugar plantation-based societies, we would see other Creole societies and languages emerge. It's about the only positive thing I can say about the environment in which the enslaved people lived in 1690 is that, yes, they would create a new society, a new language, a new culture eventually. But in 1690, things looked very, very difficult if you were an enslaved person on a sugar plantation. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for hearing me. And I look forward to any questions you may have.